A late 40s queue, the everyday price of victory. Tired people in worn clothes waiting endlessly for drab rations. It speaks too of fairness, of hardship shared deep into the peace. The workforce laboured flat out to provide the basics for the home market and the best goods for export. And lurking behind it all was the nagging fear that everything might soon have to be thrown back onto a war footing if tensions with Russia went critical.
I am not getting excited, but I haven't got a blooming sweet in my mouth since rationing begun. She always pinches me coupons.
Dear, I did warn you, Nellie.
Take no notice, Mother. You don't like sweets any road.
It's the principle of the thing. The government gives coupons to me, not your mother.
Don't be so daft, Joe. A big chap like you going on about a few sweets.
Oh, Dad,
A few sweets. I wouldn't mind if you weren't always sucking them in front of me face. Suck, suck, suck. Yeah, what are you doing? You shut up.
Neighbours of mine in Walthamstow who grew up with rationing can still remember the skill it took to tart up the bare necessities.
Our mums are very economical. I mean, they just made things. I mean, for instance, if you had you made something like, or talked about you was going to make a bread pudding, my Aunt Floss would say to my mum, well, she'd got this and my mum had got that, and collectively they'd make a bread pudding. And it would be cooked in most probably our oven because my mum made a pretty good bread pudding. And then, but part of it went to Aunt Floss and part of it went to Aunt Maud, you know, and it was sort of shared out in that aspect. You know, they didn't have enough to make individual bread puddings, but collectively they could make one. And, you know, that's just how it was.
An entire generation still carries those ration books with them in a siege economy of the mind. They can't bear waste or throwing anything useful away. They prefer to mend rather than buy anew.
Living in the far north in 1946, it really was living in a siege economy. The problem was that these people in this little town typically had all been through the war together, and they'd learned to barter and say, well, you've been straight with me, I'll be straight with you, and I'll give you this and I'll give you that. Well, if you land there, and especially if you've got an educated voice, you're going to have a hard time.
I remember one woman saying to me, tickets for everything. We'll have to have a ticket for breathing soon. It felt like that. You had tickets, coupons for clothes, coupons for bed linen, all household linen, coupons for shoes, and for cloth, for wool for knitting.
We needed curtains for the front room, and our landlady said, do you really think you need curtains? And he said, well, you know, there's a street there. And what we bought was discarded undertaker's cotton, which had been made for the war, and not as many as died as they'd expected. We got that for about a bob a yard.
Take a look at this, the News of the World for July the 21st, 1946. Bread buying rush on eve of rationing. Somehow the British people had got through 6 years of war. If you'd sat in this kitchen that Sunday, you might have thought that there was nothing for which the British housewife hadn't already queued. And now, bread. How about this for a week's intake of food before the loaf went on the ration? 8 ounces of fats and 8 of sugar, 4 ounces of bacon and 4 ounces of jam, 2 ounces of cheese and 2 ounces of tea, 2 pints of milk, and luxury of luxuries, 1 egg. I lived off this for a week quite recently. I lost 2 pounds. I was very bored, but I didn't go hungry. Potatoes saw to that. Mind you, I hadn't grown tired of it over 6 years, and I wasn't surrounded by a complaining family.
Wild rabbits obviously weren't on the ration, and you would start queuing at the crack of dawn. I mean, and my mother would get down in the queue and would set the alarm and say to my older brother, you know, when the alarm goes off, and he would go down and get in the queue, and my mum would come back and, you know, make a cup of tea and have something to eat and get my younger brother and I up, you know. So, and then she would go back down and get back in that queue to get that rabbit.
Cathay Gazette takes up the cudgels in the fight to end queuing, while the ministries of...
Hours of queuing filled a reservoir of resentment just waiting for someone to open the floodgates. Irene Lovelock, a Croydon vicar's wife, did just that. The Housewives' League she founded in 1945 swiftly became a noisy national phenomenon.
Before she got to her place in the queue to get something, fish was off, and that was the umpteenth day in a row when she'd waited in a queue and it was raining, and the women behind her said, "This is terrible, can't somebody do something?"
I do believe that a nationwide rising of the housewives would end this terrible curse of queuing. Without the British housewife, this war could never have been won. We have suffered enough. Surely we should not be asked to put up with any more.
This was taken up, and before she knew where she was, she couldn't get into her door for letters. Special deliveries in sacks came. And within, she said it was a nightmare. She sat down and wept. Her husband came, her children came from school, they opened letters. Shilling a year it was for membership. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds from all over the country. That's how it began.
Food cuts agitation went a step further. Queue-busting clergyman's wife, Mrs. Lovelock, spectacled chairman of the British Housewives' League, led a deputation of 3 armed with a protest resolution to Whitehall and Food Minister Sir Ben Smith.
There was a bunch, the most incredible bunch of Tory women called the Housewives' League. And they were sort of Tory woman militant. And they used to go around and try to break up our meetings by heckling and shouting so that the speaker couldn't be heard. They were, of course, people whom the government was never going to win over because they persuaded themselves that none of this austerity was necessary. Well, those of us, like myself, who was parliamentary private secretary to Harold Wilson as president of the Board of Trade, we knew the facts which made austerity necessary, the fact that you had to ration the expenditure of hard currency on things for people to consume at home in order that we could export.
It was very, very monotonous. And that is why, when people kept a few rabbits, and they did in the towns and places too, when you could actually make a rabbit pie and have your friends in, it was almost like cocking a snook at the minister. And we all liked doing that. I think there was a great feeling of relief. At least that's one thing. We've had a jolly evening and a couple of rabbits under a crust.
Hello? What's your tosh? What's your tish? Here. Want to buy 22 tons of terribly twisted, taken up tram lines. Tosh, 4.5. 22 tons of terribly twisted, taken up tram lines, Tish. Steel? No, I've got 'em honest.
Shortages produced the spivs, their flash-airy dress and style, very much part of 40s humour and folklore, when virtually anything money could buy, rationed or not, might be persuaded to fall off the back of a lorry or a workbench.
During the war, and for some time afterwards, you could buy things like ordinary lighters, because people who worked in factories got a bit naughty and took a bit of material, and they made little lighters, you see. Hey, what about a lighter? And it was so cheap, you thought, well, it's a bit of a spitfire, you know. So they weren't allowed to do it, but they were doing it and making quite a bit of money. I mean, it was all black market, you see. And, of course, it was like tish and tosh. What's your tish? What's your tosh? Want to buy an oil stove? It's hot.
Unlike that oil stove, Britain froze in January 1947. The worst winter of the century made bleaker still by a coal shortage. The king and his family left their icebox of a palace for a long-planned tour of South Africa.
It was only about the time that he left Southampton, and I went down and saw him off, and I can remember it snowing then. And London was under snow for 6 weeks or more. I can remember walking across the park each day in snow boots, and I used to wear spats, old-fashioned spats, which I dug out in order to keep my ankles warm inside Buckingham Palace. That was. It was very cold.
It really hit me because I'd got 3 small children and the windows were frozen solid. You didn't need curtains at all. You just went to bed with a light on and turned it off and when you got into bed. But we were short of coal, of course, and we had a fire, just a fire. You didn't have central heating or anything like that. And we used to push the pram up to coal merchants called Silks, and we'd bring back a sack of coal on it, and that would keep us going for a while. And we had a back boiler, so that gave us hot water. But even then, the water froze, so you still hadn't got anything.
We went and got sacks of logs, you know, from a firm in Wood Street, and we just literally dragged them because there was only the 2 of us. It was quite heavy, so we had to drag them all the way home, but it did give them a fire, you know.
Even from the gilded corridors in Whitehall, you could sense the real hardship caused by rationing and the economic sacrifices of wartime. Behind the scenes, the invisible world of international finance caused the government of Prime Minister Attlee acute concern. Britain would have gone bankrupt as early as 1941, but for Lend-Lease from the United States, which kept us supplied with food and weaponry. And as soon as the war was over, America cut off all aid. Unless the new Labour government could restore that dollar lifeline, 46 million British people faced even tougher rations than during the war. Ministers had no alternative but to try and negotiate a new American loan, though some of them, including Ernest Bevin, who presided here in the Foreign Office, could scarcely bear the thought of having to go cap in hand once more to Washington.
Bevin, incidentally, started absolutely opposed to borrowing money from the Americans. But after 3 months of argument, when he found what the food rations would have to be reduced to if we didn't, he was forced to come round. But he used to walk down the passage, that long passage, number 10. If he saw me, he always said, "Any danger of a settlement tonight?" That meant he would do all he could to prevent borrowing money from the Americans, but of course it was inevitable.
First announcement that US congressman had passed the British loan brings Chancellor of the Exchequer Hugh Dalton with a special message to you on what the loan means.
The vote by the American Congress of the loan to Britain is good news.
But the loan swiftly drained away. Despite all-out production on the land, within a year it was plain that without more dollars, Britain would be in desperate straits.
In the summer of 1947, the Treasury peered into the abyss. Britain was in the middle of a huge sterling crisis. The money might run out, and if American dollars weren't forthcoming, Britain would have to get by with a famine food program, children's school holidays altered so they could bring in the harvest, and the only houses built would be those for farm workers and miners. This is the single bleakest piece of paper in the late 1940s.
The great ports of the United States surge with activity as Marshall Aid cargoes reach the docks. The bustling days of
rescue was in sight, not just for Britain, but for Western Europe as a whole. Marshall Aid, a huge recovery program, was signed into law by President Harry Truman.
Are some of the men who made the great beginning possible.
Our economy faces its most vital period since the Industrial Revolution.
Marshall Aid gave Britain breathing space, no more. The really difficult task of modernising the economy and breaking the cycle of crisis fell to Dalton's successor as Chancellor, the wealthy but Spartan Christian socialist Stafford Cripps.
No doubt we're in a bit of a tough spot, and it'll take a year or two to get out. But we've done it before, and we can do it again.
He thought that other people had the same amount of self-discipline as he had himself, which made him a very formidable character, but in other ways misled him a great deal because people didn't behave in the way in which he expected them to behave very often.
The BBC joined in the production drive with its daily Music While You Work. Cripps was not the last Chancellor to urge us to export or perish. and he even managed to persuade the unions to curb wage demands voluntarily. Exports grew, but not enough.
Despite some success, the export drive couldn't protect the pound from the first of many post-war attacks on its rate of exchange with the dollar, which had been fixed at £1 to $4.03 when the war began. The loss of overseas assets and markets made that rate unsustainable, and in the summer of 1949, it began to buckle. And here in the room of the Chancellor, who was by now a sick man, you could almost feel Britain's gold and dollar reserves melting away.
I had the figures every week in this room of what we called the dollar drain those days. And I had to alert senior ministers. Stafford Cripps' health was collapsing and he was due to leave in a week, as to how severe the problem was.
Now I have here, Lord J, what was perhaps the hottest piece of paper in Whitehall in 1949, that devaluation summer. I have a suspicion that you may well have drafted this in this very room yourself.
Yes, at the end of the last of our small meeting with Attlee over the way, he asked Gateskill and me to draft a letter and bring it on the following Sunday week to him at Chequers, which he would then sign and send to Stafford Cripps. The document which you have here was typed out, put in about 3 envelopes, one on top of another, and Hugh Gateskill and I drove down to Chequers on a beautiful Sunday afternoon and handed it over to Attlee, who signed it.
A transatlantic airliner touches down at London Airport and sets off Crisis Week in Britain. Welcomed home from America is a man with a secret. Only a handful know of the dramatic announcement.
The pound came down from $4.03 to $2.80. At last, British exports, no longer overvalued, could compete powerfully on world markets. Devaluation was necessary, but for a proud, great power, it was a humiliation, however it was dressed up.
We'd always known that we were dependent uniquely on the Americans, but it also seemed now to many of us, and to me perhaps regrettably for the first time, that we were dependent on not only the Americans but other nations as well. And that was the paradox, I think, to me at any rate, between the victors, but we didn't get the spoils.
A moment to savour. Confident in their country's esteem and surrounded by their political leaders, a relaxed royal family salute the triumphant forces of the British Empire. Yet no one on that platform foresaw the slide to come. Victory blinded them.
I think we did feel we were still a great power, and I think in many ways we were still a great power. We had, after all, won the war. We still had the empire. We still had the special relationship with the United States. I think we were still a great power. What I think we failed to realize was the extent to which our economy had been weakened by the war, the extent to which it would be difficult to go on playing the sort of role which we were still playing at the end of the war, and the fact that other people's aspirations were changing and other people's power was changing.
We were all misguided, you see. We thought we had ended the war, and we did end the war at the top of the world. We still commanded 1/4 of the Earth's surface and 1/4 of the Earth's population. We had no idea of the extent to which the standing and power of Britain would diminish over the next 40 or 50 years. It simply didn't occur to us that we weren't at the top table playing the leading hand.
That hand was now being played by the huge fist of Ernest Bevin with a John Bull-like determination abroad. Attlee placed the unlikely figure of this trade union rough diamond to run the ever-polished Foreign Office.
Learned Bevin was a very powerfully built man. He was as broad as he was long, and about as high as he was broad. He was like a tank.
He was a tremendous patriot, you see, and that everybody respected. Physically vast man. I often wonder how the Hansard people ever got his speeches, which started off with tremendous sentences which never had a subject and never had a main verb, and went on for about 5 minutes. My idea of a foreign policy is to buy a ticket at Victoria Station and go where the hell you want.
Everybody knew what he meant, though.
Oh, yes. And of course, everybody resounded. He had the resonance of his character. He struck a chord in everybody's heart.
He was a tremendous believer in Britain's paramount role as one of the world's great powers. It was he, above all, who insisted that we should develop our own atomic bomb with a Union Jack on the top of it, as he said, in order to be equal with the Americans.
Still the world's first and only nuclear power, the Americans dropped their latest bomb in 1946. Though British scientists had played a key wartime role in developing the weapon, virtually all future collaboration had been made illegal by the American Congress. Britain had to decide whether to go it alone.
When a country decides to become a nuclear power, it is changed forever as a nation. Britain so decided on the 8th of January 1947, when a tiny group of ministers met in number 10 Downing Street to decide to make a British atomic bomb. Significantly, Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, the driving force behind that decision, says we could not afford to acquiesce in an American monopoly of this new development. Not a word about the Russians.
Bevin was characteristically combative about a British bomb. Was the cautious Attlee equally convinced?
Although he was anxious to preserve the connection with the United States, you can't trust them. You never know. They might change their mind. They might change their views. Otherwise, if you could rely on them 100%, you could simply say, well, let's borrow one of yours from time to time. But no, you must have one of your own.
But real fear of another wartime ally, Stalin, drove foreign policy. Russia hadn't fully demobilized after the war. Concentrations of troops pressed menacingly against the borders of Western Europe. In Moscow, diplomat Frank Roberts urged containment rather than confrontation. In this series of crucial telegrams, he helped fashion the new tough line on Russia.
You've got to conduct your work with them on a basis of very, very strict realism and never give them the impression that they've only got to push and the door will then open. You've got to have a door which, even though their tanks could obviously knock it down, would mean knocking it down, it would mean war, it would mean danger, which the Russians will not do. And with that kind of policy of realism, then we can maintain a working relationship with the Russians worldwide. But we can't go on with a policy of illusions. That was really what the message was. But it wasn't a message of we want a Cold War and we want to defeat the Russians, not at all. It was the only way to work with them in the world is realism, and to use a later phrase, containment.
The fact was that at the end of the war, all the Red Army needed to reach the North Sea was boots. Now, we don't yet, we probably will get in the very near future some of the key Soviet documents of the period. But I think the important thing to remember is that even if the Russians had no active intention to invade Western Europe, the fact that they had the power to do so had an enormous effect on the confidence of the West Europeans.
But Berlin faces
Economic changes in the British and American sectors of Germany gave the Russians an excuse to throw a land blockade round Berlin. Suddenly, fears about the bomb and the possibility of World War III went critical.
The people of Berlin face a bleak future.
Bevin looked at it and said, well, there's one place where we have written rights, and that is in the air corridors. There is no blockade there, And the Russians are usually, and I would entirely agree with this, are usually careful not to break a written agreement. They will misinterpret it, they will twist it, they will do all kinds of things, and of course eventually if they're going to war they will tear it up. But if they're not going to war, and they never did. And the other thing was with the Russians that we all worked in Bevin, as much as any of us, on the principle that it was a funny kind of relationship in which neither side wanted to be the first to shoot, that neither side wanted there to be a shooting war.
Despite the success of the air bridge to Berlin, Bevin was determined that Britain should channel the response of the West to the Cold War into something truly substantial. The Attlee government invited American bombers back into East Anglia, but would Washington bite on Bevin's plan for a North Atlantic alliance?
He had the idea that there must be not simply Europe getting together economically, but they must provide with America, crucially having America in some sort of defense against what was thought to be a serious Soviet threat. And when people now, looking back, say, what did the special relationship provide for America? We know what it's provided for Britain. What did America get out of it? One of the things I believe they got out of it was the role Britain played, Bevin in particular, but Britain played in bringing up Europe along and explaining and bringing America into the idea of the North Atlantic Treaty, which must rank as one of the most successful alliances in history.
It's easy to see why NATO was pieced together at such speed when you get your hands on an assessment like this one from the British Joint Intelligence Committee, produced at the height of the Berlin airlift, which shouldn't be available even now. It came out by accident. Although the analysts didn't think the Russians were going to be in a position to start World War III until about 1957, the sheer weight of weaponry that they've got in here, 500 tanks a month, 300 fighters, 150 new bombers, is absolutely chilling. And above it all, the possibility that the Soviet Union would be nuclear tipped within a couple of years or so. What's absolutely plain too from this document is that MI6 didn't have a highly placed mole at the top of the Kremlin or the Soviet military to give them an insight into the mindsets of those Russian leaders and what they really were up to. The undercover nature of the Cold War powerfully fed the climate of fear, and our embassy across the river from the Kremlin was a prime espionage target in Moscow.
We had a sort of late 18th century, early 19th century flat with a lot of what my wife used to call patisserie, you know, plaster work on the ceilings all around. And in those rather early days, you had these hearing devices were put in the plaster. You could almost see them. You knew where to talk into them, roughly. And when they were all taken out, our two vulgar German maids, they were very horrified because the things they'd been saying to each other, of course, which was being taken down in evidence against them. I think, funnily enough, that Stalin thought we did have, you know, just as he had his methods of listening into what went on in the British embassy across the river, I think he thought that we had the same kind of thing to get back into the Kremlin.
But we didn't.
Of course we didn't.
Though Britain was moleless in Moscow until the late 50s, we had our own intelligence officers housed undercover in the embassy.
Oh, they were in absolutely no doubt who we were, and everything we did was in the blazing light of surveillance and being watched. And of course, you stood as a foreigner to every Russian. I can remember, quite by chance, because I was rather a dowdy creature in those days, quite often I used to look very like a Russian woman. I used to have a shawl over my head and, you know, ancient fur coat and valinki, those big felt boots. And I said one day innocently to some colleague in the embassy, well, I reckon in any case I probably melt into the background better than any of you because I looked like a Russian. And he looked at me and said, yes, dear, but you don't walk like one, you walk like a free woman. And it was true. I didn't plod or shuffle. I bounced along, and all sorts of unconscious things like that.
In the late 1940s, British intelligence chiefs knew just how hard it was to penetrate the Soviet Union and how few people they had to do it. What they didn't know was how big the Soviet spy network was in the United Kingdom. Now, these documents from the Cabinet Committee on Subversive Activities, which are still to reach the public domain, show that they knew that during World War II, some of their own intelligence people were distorting material to the advantage of the communist cause. And this document, from a particularly fraught moment in the Cold War in 1950, shows that MI5 told that same cabinet committee they had no fewer than 250,000 files on known communists or possible communist sympathizers. That's 1 in every 184 of the population was suspected of being capable of passing on material to Stalin's spies. Quite amazing. Fear of communism was fueled by a succession of spy scandals. In 1951, 2 diplomats defected to Moscow. One of them, Donald Maclean, had worked in a sensitive section of the Washington embassy.
Attlee was very upset. Attlee was a great believer, in people who'd been to a decent public school. It was one of his great passions, the public school, the University of Oxford, and the regular army. Those are the 3 things he really cared for.
Donald Maclean's benefaction to the Russians wasn't simply the knowledge of the North Atlantic Treaty, but a great deal of information on atomic energy. There was always one person in the British Embassy at that time who acted as the channel of information between London and Washington. And that was Donald Maclean, and I succeeded him in that position. So I know how valuable was the atomic information that Maclean was capable of giving the Russians.
Guy Burgess was quite a different character. I knew Guy because when I was private secretary to Annie Bevan, he was private secretary to Hector McNeill. So we had to have dealings. Well, I can't claim that I saw through him as a communist agent. I did see through him to the extent that any course of action he suggested, you must do the opposite, because he was so completely wrong-headed.
The invasion of South Korea by the Communist North in June 1950 was seen in the West as an opening move by a now nuclear-armed Russia that might end in World War III. The Attlee government quickly sent British troops to Korea, and under intense American pressure, began a rearmament program that eventually quadrupled defense spending plans.
The political pressures were enormous. Even Hugh Gates supported the rearmament program. I remember my friend Otto Clark in the Treasury saying a chancellor hasn't any business supporting any expenditure program. Hugh Gates supported the rearmament program, and it was entirely for political reasons, which seemed to many people valid at the time. I'm not sure that I quite shared that view, but the main impetus for this was the desire to stand side by side with the United States as a major world power.
In the cabinet, Nye Bevan snapped over defence spending plans which led to NHS charges on teeth and spectacles. 2 other ministers, Harold Wilson and John Freeman, also quit. But the economic shock of rearmament was even greater. British industry, boosted by the 1949 devaluation, was facing its best prospect before or since of an export-led recovery, an economic miracle that would combine high growth with low inflation.
We got knocked off course by the Korean War for 2 reasons. One was that we were induced to, as it were, drop everything and put all our resources into a big increase in defense expenditure. That meant that, in fact, we cut back a lot of our exports of metal goods, which are the goods in most demand. We cut back very heavily our provision for investment by discouraging our firms investing because we wanted the metal goods for defense. We also, of course, suffered from a sharp increase in raw material prices at the time of the Korean War, and indeed a shortage of raw materials.
The fact remains that the total burden put on the British economy from whichever source was too great. And here I would like to quote the words with which Adam Smith, that great exponent of economic liberalism, ends The Wealth of Nations. Great Britain should, in her future endeavors, remember the true mediocrity of her situation. And that was said in 1776. How much truer was it in 1945, 50?
The words British and Empire were synonymous, Empire meant India, jewel in the crown of both our imperial and our national identity. So in February 1947, when Attlee told the Commons Lord Mountbatten was to oversee independence, he was signalling the end of Britain's superpowerdom and the end of the world for some old India hands.
The bottom had dropped out of my world, and the assumptions and presumptions with which I had returned to this country from India and out of uniform had gone, and I had to find my way in a new world. I remember I wandered round the streets in London that night, sitting on doorsteps with my head in my hands, wondering what to do and where to go.
Is that the moment when your conception of your nation, its extended family as you might have conceived it, its place in the world, changed forever?
It must have been one of the steps towards that change. It was a shattering moment, a shattering undeception.
Groundnuts, peanuts, call them what you like. As small as they are, they've called...
Africa was now designated by Attlee and his ministers as the new jewel in the crown. Economic schemes like groundnuts were part of an emotional substitute for the old Indian empire, gift-wrapped as a new, multiracial commonwealth.
The trouble, really, in my opinion, was that at the time we withdrew from India, we should have had a really thorough, objective look about the Commonwealth. The trouble is that the Commonwealth had become a sort of sentimental myth. In fact, I think you could pretty well prove, if you did a cost-benefit analysis, that the Commonwealth in all its various forms was more of a liability to us than an asset, but that is not a view that anybody likes to take publicly.
We didn't realize the extent to which other countries had perfectly properly different aspirations. I very well remember, for example, in I think it was 1951, when Australia and New Zealand signed the thing called the ANZUS Treaty with the United States, which, with hindsight, was absolutely sensible, reasonable, and rather desirable thing for them to do. And I remember the shock in London, and the feeling that somehow they'd behaved rather improperly, and that if they were going to be in it, we had to be in it too. Okay, it was a regional grouping. We weren't actually in the South Pacific, but nevertheless, we should be part of it. And it was quite wrong for two Commonwealth governments to be doing this on their own.
Our idea of ourselves at the beginning of the 50s was of a country with worldwide interests too great to be crammed into any narrow definition of a new Europe. So when the plan for a European coal and steel community was being drawn up across the Channel, apart from one or two forward-looking people here in the Foreign Office, it was simply a non-starter in terms of Britain as a full member. The notion has grown up that Britain suffered mightily from missing the European bus. But in 1950, it was plain that Jean Monnet, the great technocrat and driver of that bus, and his conductor, Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, simply didn't want Britain on board, delaying and complaining.
I remember just when I was going home about 8 o'clock, my private secretary told me that there was some scheme invented by the French for a coal and steel organization, but we'd had a message saying that we must give an answer, yes or no, would be joined by 8 o'clock tomorrow being Friday, that they could give us no details of what was in this scheme, whatever, and thirdly, that if we didn't accept it without knowing what it was by 8 o'clock the following evening, we would be permanently excluded from the discussions.
I was doing the internal political reporting in Paris when the offer of the coal and steel plan came, the Schuman plan. I remember this very well because I met at a party Mr. Clapier, who was at that time private secretary to Schuman and later became governor of the Bank of France. And I said, well, you really haven't given us any hope. We have a Labour government. We have a very strong coal and steel unions. How can you expect us to join in 24 hours or whatever it was? It was a bit more than that, but it wasn't. It was a very short time. And he said, oh, have no illusions. We're well aware of that. We don't want you to join. You'll only slow things down and you'll invent a million pretexts and you'll refer it to and fro, and the whole process will grind to a halt.
It was the French ultimatum that prompted Herbert Morrison's famous comment, "It's no good, the Durham miners won't wear it." The cabinet wouldn't wear it either, for several reasons.
The first was the more immediate one, which was that we don't want our industry, which is comparatively unravaged, compared, for example, with the Germans, messed up by having to conform to the pace of the French and German industry. We can do all right by ourselves. Now, this was very strongly Ernie Bevin's view. Let's cooperate, yes, for heaven's sake, but don't let any of those people shove their fork in.
We met, and in our cabinet, there wasn't a great deal of discussion because clearly it was impossible to promise to adopt the scheme, none of the details of which we knew. But the discussion was how to send the most amicable and conciliatory message possible back to the French government.
The right, whether it was the right of the Labour Party, as it is today, or whether it was the Tories, were worried about sovereignty, primarily about sovereignty, and whether this was really the right club for us to go into. Catholic, liberal, in an extreme sense of the word, talking foreign languages all the time and all the rest of it, bureaucratic probably because their own systems in France and Italy and Germany were bureaucratic, and so on. The left was worried about the fact that this was essentially a liberal experiment in the sense of free trade and so on, and that combined with being subjected to the dictates of an international institution would interfere with planning.
Such manifestations of insularity were not confined to the British Isles. Like the white Durham miners, the black and brown subjects of the empire had strong views on what Britishness meant.
Yes, I was a part of the British Empire. England was in Jamaica for nearly 300 years at that time, and everything that we did, we were brought up to believe that we were part of the British Empire.
You see, you must remember from you're young, that's implanted in your brain about the empire and about the British. I mean, I have no allegiance to the American flag or the German flag or the Italian flag. I'm British. And if Britain did something, then I'm happy about it and I'm proud about it.
London is the place for me. London.
Many West Indian servicemen returned after the war to face unemployment, especially in hurricane-hit Jamaica. They itched to return. And when the troopship Empire Windrush stopped by in May 1948, over 400 decided to take their chance.
I was on the leeward side of a ship, and I saw a man about 45 crying, water running down his cheek. And I said, what is wrong? He said, they are going to turn us back. I said, what? Tell me exactly what happened. He said he heard on the 6 o'clock news that if there is any disturbance on the SS Empire Windrush, that the ship should be turned back to Jamaica. I said, they will not turn us back. And I got two ex-wireless operators to play dominoes underneath the window of the wireless room. And by that, we learned everything that was being said in Westminster.
When the Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury, most of its passengers had nowhere to go. The authorities passed the buck furiously from one to another. A London-based West Indian community worker, fresh from the RAF, had stayed here, beneath my feet in the deep air raid shelters left over from the war and now used by servicemen in transit. He told the Colonial Office the passengers wouldn't leave the Windrush unless they were given permission to come to Clapham. The Colonial Office gave in. So, home for the first West Indian immigrants to Britain after the war was literally underneath my feet. From here, they walked to the nearby labour exchanges in Brixton, and that's how modern, multiracial Brixton was born.
Despite their wartime service, West Indians found post-war Britain less welcoming. The housing shortage fostered hostility.
When I got the mob, I came to London, and I wanted somewhere to live. And at that time, on the shop boards, shop fronts, there were notices, room to let. And I rang up several places. The rooms were there. They said I should come along. And when I get there, the room had just gone. And then that was the time I began to notice the great change that have taken place in such a short period.
You see, I wanted a room, and I knew from the beginning that a white person, even if they wanted to rent me a room, they wouldn't, because they admitted to me they don't want the neighbors to see a colored person come out of their house. So now and again you'd look for a sign, and you see it says, room for rent, no Irish, no coloreds, no children, no dogs. I didn't mind being put with the Irish, but I thought it was a bit of a come down being put with the dogs.
I've always complained that none of the government, neither Labour nor the Conservatives, have taken time off to educate the people about our presence here. After all, we saw our presence here as a political one. We saw our presence here as a part of history.
History meant a great deal to the British of all colours in mid-century, especially in 1951, when the government-sponsored Festival of Britain on the south bank of the Thames sought to demonstrate how an ancient, victorious people could be as daring and inventive in peace as in war. There was a new festival hall and a great aluminium dome of discovery.
We'd lived all our conscious lives in pretty gloomy and austere times, when everything was dark and dim and run down. Nothing in London had been painted because of the war. Everything had fallen into disrepair. And suddenly here was this great sunburst of colour and light. Everything had been planned on this site to delight. Everything had been thought out by the human mind to look good. So there wasn't optimism. Optimism was the note of the times. It was certainly assumed that we were going to get wealthier, society was going to get more just, poverty was gradually going to be abolished. All these assumptions now seem as remote as something out of the Middle Ages.
The Festival of Britain was all very eye-opening to us, but I don't think it actually registered much of the future. It was all just something to see. The biggest fun for us was the Battersea Funfair afterwards, you know, going in there and screaming like hell on the rides. Letting your skirts blow up and show your knees.
I think the Skylon would probably have been just about over there, which I suppose if there's one symbol that's remembered from the festival, it's the Skylon. Now tell me about it. I think you described it as a luminous exclamation mark.
Yes, it was a great cigar-shaped thing, apparently hanging in space. It was very cunningly supported on cables, and it did become a symbol. Somebody said it was characteristic of Britain that it was without visible means of support.
A lot of people came. A lot of people enjoyed it. There weren't enough blues. The ice cream ran out. But on the whole, people had a good time. And I would say the Festival of Britain was a gesture. Not exactly a futile gesture, but a slightly desperate gesture to show that we were still alive, still kicking. In fact, we were absolutely down on our uppers.
On our uppers, did the festival help explain why, with its loving evocation of an old system of government? Certainly the jet age was represented, science and mathematics too, but look at that steam engine with the age of diesel-electric already beckoning. Even when flaunting its essence to the world, 1951 Britain was still a lion and unicorn nation with a dash of the new, but where modernity was a pushover for the pull of the past.
Next week, the coronation, rock and roll and the 4-minute mile, as Peter Hennessy traces events in Britain from 1951 to 1956. That's next Sunday at 8.